I'm Joe, 27M, and the middle child in a family of 4 siblings. There's Marie, 33F, the eldest, always the golden child, my brother Aaron, 29M, who's next in line for the crown, and finally, Abby, 25F, the youngest and somehow always the most beloved. Growing up, it was pretty clear where I stood in the hierarchy. Dead last. My parents have always had their favorites, and I just never made the cut. I don't want to come off as bitter, but the fact is, I've never gotten the same treatment as my siblings. Birthdays, holidays, even random Fridays, they'd all be showered with gifts and attention, while I'd be lucky to get a passing acknowledgement. I stopped expecting birthday presents from my family around my late teens, and true enough, it's been a decade since anyone in the family gave me one. But every year, I'm still roped into contributing for the others' extravagant group gifts, like I'm supposed to act as if everything is perfectly fine. Last week was the final straw. We were having another one of those dreaded family dinners at my parents' house. It started out like usual with small talk and catching up, but quickly turned into a festival of backhanded compliments and subtle jabs at me. You see, I had a small wedding, one that my wife and I paid for out of our own pockets. That was a point of mockery that night, disguised under the pretense of, it's okay, as long as you loved it. My parents had paid for Marie's beachside ceremony, Aaron's mountain retreat, and Abby's lavish hotel ballroom affair. When it came to me, we can't afford it right now, Joe. We're saving up for Abby's wedding. It was like they didn't even see the contradiction. At the dinner, Marie went on and on about how she couldn't have imagined her dream wedding without Dad's support. Then Aaron jumped in, reminiscing about the time Mom and Dad covered the full cost of his destination wedding, including plane tickets for the entire extended family. They threw me a pitying glance, and it was clear what they were thinking. It's too bad you couldn't do better, Joe. They didn't just stop at the wedding. Throughout the dinner, they casually talked about how little student debt they have, thanks to our parents' generous help. Marie went to a private 4-year college, living in the dorms with all expenses paid. Aaron had a similar deal, studying abroad with all his tuition, rent, and travel costs covered. Even Abby, who attended a prestigious art school, never had to worry about rent or student loans. Meanwhile, I went to a highly competitive watchmaking school. It wasn't glamorous, but I loved it. I got a stipend for attending, so I paid rent at home to contribute. The only help I got from my parents was $7,000 for my tools, and while I'm grateful, it's nowhere near the $150,000 plus they each received for tuition, living expenses, and whatever else. When I decided to go back to school later on, I did it on my own. No help, no financial support, just me hustling to make it work. But when Aaron made the same decision a few years later, my parents jumped in immediately, covering every single expense without him even having to ask. Somehow, I'm expected to believe it's all fair and equal. Dinner that night dragged on painfully. They went on about their expensive cars, their newest gadgets, and all the lifestyle upgrades they could afford, thanks to Mom and Dad. Every few minutes, there was a reminder of what I never had and would probably never get. But the moment that made me finally lose, it wasn't about money or material things. It was when Aaron and his wife started gushing about their amazing spontaneous date night the previous Friday. How they just decided to go out to this fancy steakhouse because, why not? I knew that night. That was the same Friday when my parents had canceled plans with my wife and me at the last minute. We had spent hours cooking my grandfather's signature ziti and meatballs, complete with homemade marinara, my mom's favorite dish. She's always loved it when I cook for her. But instead of coming over, they had called an hour before dinner, saying they had an emergency and had to watch Aaron's kids. I told them it was fine, that we'd reschedule. It wasn't until that moment at dinner that I found out the real reason they bailed. They weren't babysitting because of an emergency. They had canceled on us so they could watch Aaron's kids while he and his wife went on a spontaneous date to Texas Roadhouse. Hearing that was like a punch to the gut. I'd put in so much effort for something so simple, just a dinner together, and they dropped us, just like that, because Aaron's night out was more important. I stared down at my plate, feeling the weight of everything that had built up over the years. The unfairness, the favoritism, the way I was always overlooked. And then I did something I've never done before. I stood up, pushed my chair back, and without saying a word, I walked out. My wife, bless her, saw what was happening and followed me immediately. The silence in the room was deafening as we left. I didn't look back, didn't pause, just kept walking until we were out the front door and in our car, driving away from what felt like the final breaking point. My mom called me later that night. She was confused, asking why I left so abruptly. So I told her. I laid it all out, every single bit of it, the favoritism, the exclusion, the constant feeling of being second-rate in my own family. I wasn't expecting an apology or a grand realization from her, but I needed to say it, to put it out there to make them hear me for once. She got quiet. She didn't interrupt me for once. And when I finally finished talking, she just sighed and said she was sorry I felt that way. That's it. No explanation, no acknowledgement of what had been done, just a vague apology for my feelings. I hung up, feeling even emptier than before. I wasn't sure what I expected, but it was still a gut punch. A few days later, I started getting angry texts from Marie and Aaron. Apparently, Mom had shared my rant with them, and now they were furious. "Why are you keeping score, Joe? It's immature to hold grudges. You ruined dinner, Joe." It was like they didn't even hear a word I said. I wasn't keeping score. I was finally standing up for myself, but to them, the fact that I'd even dare to say something was proof that I was the problem. And that's when it hit me. I'd never be able to make them understand. They didn't want to understand. That was just the beginning. After that disastrous dinner, I couldn't stop replaying everything in my head. It wasn't just about that one night. It was the culmination of years of feeling invisible, of being cast aside in favor of my siblings. I knew I needed to dig deeper into what had happened over the years. Maybe if I laid it all out, I could make sense of it, show it to my parents, or at least put it down so I could finally put it behind me. I started by looking back at the numbers. My parents had always said they treated us fairly, that they gave us all equal opportunities, but I knew that wasn't true. They had paid for Natalie's and Mark's expensive university tuitions, their living costs, their cars, and even the down payments for their homes. They never even asked them to contribute a single cent. Erica, being the youngest, got everything handed to her without even asking. When she wanted to go to that fancy art school, my parents didn't blink at the cost. But when I needed help, I got a fraction of what they had given them, $7,000 for my watchmaking tools, which they somehow equated to the $150,000 they each got. I went through the numbers again and again, trying to wrap my head around it. I even sat down with my wife, Sarah, and we compiled everything I could remember. What they spent on each of us, what they claimed was fair and equal. When I finally tallied it all up, I was shocked. My siblings had each received between $120,000 to $150,000 in direct financial support. And me, I got $7,000. No tuition, no rent help, no home down payments, just enough to get me started on my tools. And even then, they acted like I should be eternally grateful. I know it sounds like I'm just complaining about money, but it's not just that. It's the principle of it. I never expected them to bankroll my life the way they did for Natalie, Mark, and Erica, but I did expect them to care, to at least show some consideration. And then there were the countless small things, the gifts I never got, the holidays I was left out of, the vacations they didn't even invite me to. How was I supposed to feel anything but forgotten? And it wasn't just me who saw it. Erica, of all people, was the one who noticed something was wrong. One night, a few days after the dinner, she called me. She started apologizing, saying she had no idea things were so unfair. She'd assumed our parents had helped me out in some way. Maybe covered part of my wedding or paid off some loans I didn't talk about. But when she found out they hadn't done any of that, she was genuinely shocked. "I thought they at least paid for your wedding, Jason," she said quietly over the phone. "They always told me they'd set aside money for each of us, but..." "Yeah, well, apparently that money ran out by the time it got to me," I replied, my voice tight. "They were saving up for your wedding, remember?" There was a long silence on the line. I could practically hear her trying to piece it all together. "I didn't ask them for that, Jason," she said finally. "I had no idea they weren't helping you. They told me they were just doing the same for you as they did for the rest of us." "That's what they always said, but it wasn't true," she sighed. I don't know what to say. I feel awful. It's like they just made me the priority because I'm the baby or something. I felt a pang of guilt. I knew Erica hadn't asked for any of this. She hadn't demanded the extra support or made the decision to sideline me. If anything, she'd been the only one who ever tried to include me, but it was like she didn't see what was happening around her. She had been caught up in this twisted dynamic just as much as I had. It's not your fault, I told her softly. It's theirs. They created this mess. I guess I can't take it anymore. But Erica wasn't the only one who was clueless. My mom seemed equally baffled when I finally broke it all down for her. I sat her down a few days later, armed with my spreadsheets and calculations. I wasn't trying to make it about the money, but seeing it all in black and white like that made it impossible to ignore. Look at this, I said, pushing the printouts across the table. Do you see the disparity here? Natalie got $140,000 for her education and living expenses. Mark got $150,000 for his school and wedding. Erica, $120,000 at the very least for school and her apartment. And I got $7,000. How is that equal? Mom's eyes widened as she looked over the figures. She shook her head, as if she didn't believe what she was seeing. That can't be right. We tried to give you all the same opportunities, Jason. Did you, though? I challenged. Because when Mark wanted to go back to school, you paid for everything without question. When I wanted to do the same, you told me you couldn't afford it. That's not the same. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Instead, she just looked down at the papers, her expression blank. I didn't realize it was like this. I thought we were being fair. Well, you weren't, I said bluntly, and this isn't even counting all the other things. The birthday gifts I never got, the trips I wasn't invited on, the cars you bought for everyone but me. That's not true, she whispered. We tried to include you. You're so independent, Jason. We thought you didn't need the same help. That word, independent, rang in my ears like a bell. It was the same excuse they'd always used ever since I was a kid. They saw me as the one who didn't need anything, so they gave everything to the others. And somehow, I was supposed to be grateful for being left out. I was independent because I had to be, I said quietly. Because you didn't give me a choice. The conversation ended with her looking defeated and me feeling more lost than ever. I thought maybe laying it all out would help, would make her see the problem, but all it did was leave us both feeling raw and exposed. There was no grand reconciliation, no promises to do better, just silence and a lingering sense of hopelessness. After that, I heard nothing from her for a few days. I didn't want to push it, so I let it be. But then the texts started coming in. From Natalie and Mark, of course. They were livid. Mom must have told them about our conversation, because they were both up in arms, accusing me of being ungrateful, of trying to paint them as villains. Why are you doing this, Jason? Natalie demanded in one particularly angry message. Do you have any idea what you're putting Mom through? I'm not the one who's been unfair, I shot back. You're just mad because I finally called it out. I knew there was no point in arguing, but I couldn't help myself. They'd gotten everything handed to them on a silver platter, and yet they were acting like I was the one in the wrong. Like I was the problem for daring to speak up. Mark, predictably, took it even further. He called me, voice low and dangerous. You've always been jealous, Jason, he spat. I can't believe you'd stoop this low. You're just bitter because you didn't make the same choices we did. Yeah, I'm bitter, I agreed flatly. Bitter that I got left behind while you all got everything, but sure, let's blame my choices. I hung up before he could respond. I didn't want to hear it anymore. I was done listening to their self-righteous bullshit. But as the days passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. I had finally stood up for myself, finally pointed out the massive disparities in how we'd all been treated. And instead of owning up to it, my siblings were doubling down, acting like I was the problem. It was like I'd started a war without even realizing it. And I had no idea how to make it stop. The fallout from my confrontation with my family didn't take long to unfold. After Mom and I talked, it was as if a switch flipped in my siblings' heads. I started getting more messages, accusations, guilt trips, and attempts to twist the narrative. Natalie and Mark seemed determined to rewrite history, and even Erica, who had initially been sympathetic, was struggling to reconcile everything. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about loyalty, family dynamics, and a lifetime of pretending things were fine when they clearly weren't. Natalie's messages dripped with passive-aggressive condescension. "You're making a huge deal out of nothing, Jason," one text read. "We all had different needs, and Mom and Dad just tried to meet us where we were. Why can't you just let it go?" But how could I let it go? I'd spent years watching my siblings get showered with praise and support while I had to fight for scraps. For Natalie, with her glamorous career and beautiful family, it was easy to say I was blowing things out of proportion. She'd never been in my shoes, never felt the sting of being an afterthought. Mark Comma, on the other hand, was more blunt. His texts bordered on aggressive, calling me selfish and immature for dragging up the past. "Stop trying to make us look bad just because you didn't make anything of yourself," he wrote in one message that nearly made me throw my phone across the room. Didn't make anything of myself? I thought furiously. I had built a successful career from the ground up, attended a prestigious watchmaking school, and ran my own business. But because I wasn't flaunting a fancy degree or making six figures like Mark, I was a failure in his eyes. The worst part was that deep down, I knew exactly what this was. They weren't upset because I'd exposed some great injustice. They were upset because I had dared to challenge the status quo, to make them look at the parts of our family dynamic they'd never wanted to face. By keeping quiet, I had allowed them to maintain the illusion that everything was fair, that everyone was treated equally. And now that I'd shattered that illusion, they were scrambling to defend it. But as much as their reactions hurt, it was my parents' response that cut the deepest. A week after our initial confrontation, my dad reached out. He suggested we meet up, just the two of us, to clear the air. I didn't expect much from the conversation, but I agreed, hoping against hope that maybe, just maybe, he'd finally acknowledge the problem. We met at a small cafe in town, a neutral place far away from the house where so many of these battles had been fought. I arrived early, nursing a cup of coffee and trying to keep my expectations in check. When Dad walked in, he looked as tired as I felt. He sat down across from me, his face lined with worry. "I know things have been rough lately, Jason," he started, his voice strained. "I don't want us to be at odds like this." "Neither do I," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. "But I'm not going to pretend everything's fine when it's not." He nodded slowly, then reached into his jacket and pulled out a small folded piece of paper. He slid it across the table toward me. "I want you to have this." I unfolded it, expecting some kind of apology letter, maybe even a financial offer to make up for the disparities I'd pointed out. But it wasn't that. It was a check for $25,000. I stared at the number, disbelief washing over me. What is this?" I asked quietly. "Your mother and I talked," he said, a hint of desperation in his voice. "We realize now that we weren't fair to you. It's not enough to fix everything, I know, but it's something. We want to help." My mind raced. Part of me wanted to shove the check back at him, to tell him where he could stick his guilt money. But another part of me was just numb. Was this really how they thought they could fix things? A one-time payout to make me forget years of being treated like I didn't matter? "You think this makes it equal?" I asked, my voice low. "After giving Natalie, Mark, and Erica hundreds of thousands, you think 25 grand is going to make up for it?" Dad flinched, his gaze dropping to the table. "It's not about the amount, Jason. It's about trying to make things right. I know we should have done more, but we thought you were fine. You never asked for anything." "Because I knew you'd say no," I shot back, my voice rising despite myself. "Every time I tried to get help, you'd make some excuse about not having enough or about saving up for the others. Why would I keep asking when it was clear you'd already made up your minds?" He looked pained, like he didn't know what to say. "We were trying to do what was best for everyone. It wasn't about leaving you out." "But that's exactly what you did," I said quietly. "You left me out, and now you're trying to buy me off with a check, like that'll fix it." Silence stretched between us, thick and heavy. I could see the struggle in his eyes, the way he was grappling with what I'd said. But instead of an apology, he just sighed and leaned back in his chair. "We can't go back and change the past," he murmured. "All we can do is try to move forward." "Moving forward doesn't mean pretending it didn't happen," I replied. "It means acknowledging what you did and actually making an effort to treat me like I matter." His shoulders slumped, and for a moment he looked every bit his age. "I don't know how to do that, Jason. All I know is that I love you, and I don't want to lose you over this." I stared at him, the check still clutched in my hand. Part of me wanted to believe him, to think that maybe this was the first step toward fixing things, but another part of me knew it wasn't that simple. "This isn't about the money," I said finally, folding the check and tucking it into my pocket. "It's about everything else. The birthdays you missed, the times you chose them over me, the way you never seemed to see me standing right in front of you." He opened his mouth to respond, but I held up a hand. "I'm not saying this to hurt you. I'm saying it because I need you to understand. I need you to see what it was like for me." Dad swallowed hard, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I'm sorry, Jason. I really am." I nodded, but the words felt hollow. "I know you are, but sorry doesn't change what happened. I don't know if it ever will." We left the cafe on uncertain terms. He gave me a tentative hug, his embrace stiff and awkward. "Think about it, okay?" he murmured as he pulled away. "Just think about it." I nodded, but I didn't make any promises. I needed time to process everything, to figure out what I wanted. And most of all, time to decide if I could ever forgive them. That night, I talked it over with Sarah. She listened patiently, nodding along as I recounted the conversation. When I finally showed her the check, she raised an eyebrow. "Are you going to cash it?" she asked softly. I stared at the check for a long moment, the number blurring in my vision. "I don't know," I admitted. "I don't know if taking it would feel like a win or a betrayal." Sarah leaned over, wrapping her arms around me. "Whatever you decide, I'll support you. Just don't let them buy your forgiveness, Jason. Make them earn it." Her words echoed in my mind as I lay awake that night, the check still sitting on the nightstand. I knew what I had to do, but whether my parents and my siblings were ready to face the truth was another question entirely. A few days after my meeting with Dad, I decided it was time to confront the rest of my family. It wasn't about the money or the check. It was about them understanding how deep the wounds ran. The way they'd brushed off my pain and labeled it as bitterness made me realize that I had been too passive for too long. So I called for a family meeting. Everyone, Natalie, Mark, Erica, and both my parents at my place. I wasn't sure they'd even show up, but surprisingly, they agreed. When they arrived, the tension was palpable. We all sat in the living room, a semicircle of uncomfortable silence. Natalie looked irritated. Mark had his arms crossed defensively, and Erica was nervously fidgeting with her hands. Mom and Dad sat stiffly on the couch, their eyes darting between us. I cleared my throat and took a deep breath. "I want to talk about what happened at dinner last week and about everything that's led up to it." Mark scoffed loudly. "Oh, here we go. Another pity party for Jason." "Mark, shut up for once," Erica snapped. She glanced at me apologetically. "Sorry, please continue." I nodded gratefully. "I'm not looking for pity. I just want you all to hear me out for once. I want you to understand what it's been like for me." Natalie rolled her eyes. "We've been over this, Jason. You're making a mountain out of a molehill. You had a different path in life, and that's not anyone's fault." "It's not about the path," I shot back, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's about the way I've been treated differently at every turn. You all got support, encouragement, help, and I got what? Leftovers, if that." "That's not true," Mark snapped. "You got the same opportunities as us. You just didn't take them." "Really?" I asked, pulling out a small folder from the side table. I opened it and spread the contents on the coffee table. Spreadsheets, calculations, receipts, and notes. "Because this says otherwise." "What the hell is all this?" Natalie asked, leaning forward with a scowl. "This is a record of every major expense Mom and Dad covered for each of us. Your college tuition, your weddings, your cars, your down payments on houses, and this is what they gave me." I pointed to a small single column on the sheet labeled with my name. $7,000 for tools. That's it. The room went quiet as they looked over the documents. I watched their expressions shift from confusion to disbelief. Even Erica's eyes widened as she took in the disparity. "Jason, this is ridiculous," Mark finally muttered, shaking his head. "You can't quantify family support like this." "I'm not trying to quantify it," I said calmly. "I'm showing you the facts. For years I convinced myself it was just in my head, that maybe I was exaggerating, but seeing it like this, it's hard to ignore." Mom's eyes were glued to the papers, her face pale. Jason, we never meant for it to be like this. I thought we were helping where we could." "Helping?" I repeated incredulously, "by giving them everything and leaving me with scraps?" "Don't be dramatic," Natalie snapped, glaring at me. "We all got what we needed. If you had just asked for more—" "I did ask," I interrupted, the words bursting out of me. "I asked for help with rent when I was struggling to get through school. You know what Dad said? 'You're making money with your stipend, aren't you? You'll figure it out.'" I didn't know," Erica whispered, looking down. "I always thought they were helping you like they did for me." "Of course, you thought that," I replied softly. "Because that's what they told you. Just like they told you they paid for my wedding, remember? Turns out that was a lie too. I paid for every cent of that myself. But they said—" Erica started, but she broke off, shaking her head. "I can't believe this." "Believe it," I murmured. "The only reason I'm showing you this is because I want you to understand. I want you all to see what I've been trying to say for years. I'm not imagining things. I'm not being ungrateful. I'm just tired of being treated like I don't matter." "Jason, that's not true," Mom cried, her voice breaking. "We love you just as much as your siblings." "Then show me," I said quietly. "Stop just saying it and actually show it. Because actions speak louder than words, and your actions have shown me time and time again that I'm just less." Dad leaned forward, his face strained. "Jason, you're our son. We don't think of you as less." I turned to him, the folder still open between us. "Then why did you give them everything they ever asked for and tell me to figure it out? Why did you cancel plans with me to babysit Mark's kids so he could go out on a date? Why did you pay for their weddings and not mine?" The silence that followed was suffocating. I could see the wheels turning in his head, could see him struggling to come up with an answer that made sense. But there wasn't one. "We thought you were doing fine," he finally whispered. "You seemed so independent." "There's that word again," I muttered bitterly. "Independent. You know what independent means to me? It means being alone. It means not being able to rely on anyone. It means watching my family pour love and support into my siblings while I stand on the sidelines." Mom's eyes filled with tears, but I didn't let it sway me. "I needed to get this out, to say it all before I lost my nerve. You've spent so much time trying to make things perfect for Natalie, Mark, and Erica that you never stopped to think about what I needed," I continued. "And then when I finally snap, you try to buy me off with a check? Do you have any idea how insulting that is?" "Jason, please," Mom started, but I shook my head. "No, I'm not done," I said firmly. "You want to fix things? Then stop throwing money at it. Stop acting like all I care about is the financial disparity. I want to feel like I matter, like I'm part of this family." The room fell silent again, the only sound the ticking of the old grandfather clock in the corner. I could see the turmoil in my parents' faces, the confusion in Erica's, the stubborn disbelief in Natalie's and Mark's. "You want to know the worst part?" I asked softly, looking at each of them in turn. "The worst part is that I still love you all. I still want to be part of this family. But every time I'm around, I feel like I'm being shoved to the side, like I don't belong, and I can't keep doing that to myself." "So what do you want?" Mark demanded, his voice tight with anger. "You want us to grovel? To admit we're bad people?" "I want you to acknowledge it," I said quietly. "To admit that it wasn't fair, and that maybe, just maybe, I deserved better." "We're sorry," Dad murmured, his voice trembling. "I'm sorry, Jason. I don't know how to fix this, but I want to try." I took a deep breath, my heart aching. "Then start by treating me like a person, not just the independent one who can handle everything on his own. Stop assuming I don't need help just because I don't ask for it. Because the truth is, I've always needed help. I've just learned not to expect it." Mom nodded slowly, tears streaming down her face. "We'll do better," she whispered. "I promise. I know that doesn't fix the past, but we'll do better." I nodded, feeling a strange sense of relief wash over me. It wasn't a resolution, not really, but it was a start. "Okay," I said softly. "Let's see if you mean it." And for the first time in years, I felt like maybe, just maybe, they were finally beginning to hear me. The days after that family meeting were strange. Things didn't magically improve overnight, but I could tell my parents were trying. They started reaching out more, sending messages and calling just to check in rather than to guilt me into reconciliation. Erica, too, was making an effort. She'd send little texts every now and then, asking if Sarah and I wanted to come over for dinner or just hang out. It wasn't much, but it was a start. As for Natalie and Mark, I didn't expect anything from them, and they lived up to that expectation. After the confrontation, they went quiet. No more texts, no more passive-aggressive jabs. Part of me was relieved. The other part was just tired. I wasn't looking for apologies from them, but I'd hoped they might at least acknowledge what I said. One evening, about a week later, I got a call from Natalie. I almost didn't pick up, half convinced it would just be another round of accusations. But curiosity got the better of me, and I answered. "Hey," I said cautiously. "Jason," she began, her voice tense. "Can we talk?" "Sure. What's up?" There was a long pause. I could hear her breathing on the other end as if she were steeling herself. Finally, she let out a heavy sigh. I'm sorry," she said, the words coming out stiffly like they'd been dragged out of her against her will. "I'm sorry for dismissing you, for saying you were being immature." I blinked, momentarily speechless. This was the last thing I'd expected from her. "Wow, I don't really know what to say," I admitted. "Thanks, I guess?" "Don't get me wrong," she added quickly, her tone defensive. "I still don't think it's fair to throw all this on Mom and Dad after everything they've done for us." My brief flicker of hope dimmed, and I sighed. "Natalie, that's not what this is about. I'm not trying to make them out to be villains. I'm just trying to get them to see that I've been treated differently." "Yeah, but," she started, then stopped herself. I could almost picture her pinching the bridge of her nose in frustration. "Look, I get it, okay? You're hurt, but they really did think you were fine. They thought you didn't need the same things we did." "That's the problem," I replied quietly. "They assumed. They never asked what I needed, and I just went along with it because I didn't want to cause trouble." "I know," she murmured, her voice softening. "I'm not saying it's right. I don't know. I guess I'm trying to understand where you're coming from." I closed my eyes, feeling a mix of emotions churn in my chest. "That's all I ever wanted," I said softly, "for someone to try to understand." There was another long silence. Then, almost grudgingly, Natalie sighed. "I'm not good at this," she admitted, "but I'm going to try." It wasn't much, but it was something. "Thanks," I murmured. "That means a lot." After we hung up, I sat there for a long time, staring at the phone. I wasn't naive enough to think things would suddenly be perfect between us, but this was the first time Natalie had made any effort to see my side of things. Maybe it was the beginning of a new chapter, or maybe it was just a temporary truce. Either way, I'd take it. Mark, of course, was a different story. He didn't call, didn't text. He seemed content to ignore me, which honestly wasn't much of a change. But a few days later, Sarah came home with an odd look on her face. "What's up?" I asked, glancing up from my laptop. "You're not going to believe this," she said, holding up a small package wrapped in plain brown paper. "This came in the mail for you." I frowned, taking the package from her. There was no return address, just my name scrawled in an unfamiliar handwriting. I carefully opened it, and my eyes widened as I pulled out a small, beautifully crafted watch. It was old, but clearly well taken care of, with delicate engravings on the back. "Who sent this?" I murmured, turning it over in my hands. "There's a note," Sarah said, handing me a folded piece of paper. I unfolded it and stared at the short, blunt message written in messy script. "Dad said you like watches. It's from Pop-Pop's collection. He always said you had an eye for these things." "Mark?" I stared at the note, completely stunned. Mark had never once shown any interest in my watchmaking. He'd always dismissed it as a weird hobby, something beneath him. But this was something different. It was like a tiny olive branch, an unspoken acknowledgement that maybe, just maybe, he'd started to see me as more than just the screw-up middle brother. I didn't know what to make of it, so I put the watch on my dresser and tucked the note into my desk drawer. Maybe it meant something, maybe it didn't. But for now, I'd take it at face value. It was the first gesture of kindness he'd shown me in years, and I wasn't going to reject it out of spite. As for Erica, she'd been texting me more often, small updates about her day or pictures of things she thought I'd like. It was clear she felt guilty, like she'd failed me by not noticing how I'd been sidelined all these years. I didn't want her to feel that way, so I made a point of reassuring her whenever I could. "You didn't know," I'd told her one night when we were talking on the phone. "And it's not your job to police Mom and Dad's decisions. I'm not angry with you, Erica." "But I should have seen it," she murmured. "I should have done something." "You're doing something now," I pointed out gently. "That's more than enough." It would take time, maybe a long time, for me to fully trust them again. But at least I could see that she was trying, and that was more than I'd ever expected. As for Mom and Dad, they were struggling. I could see it in the way they tiptoed around me, in the hesitant way they spoke during our calls. They still didn't quite understand how deep the hurt went, but they were making an effort. And for now, that was enough. About a month after the meeting, they invited me and Sarah over for dinner, just the four of us. I agreed, if only to see what they had in mind. When we arrived, I noticed something different. The table was set with my favorite dishes, and there was a small stack of presents in the corner. "What's this?" I asked, eyeing the brightly wrapped boxes. Mom smiled nervously. "We realized we've missed a lot of your birthdays over the years, so we wanted to make up for it." I blinked, taken aback. "You didn't have to." "We wanted to," Dad said quietly. "I know it's not the same, but we're trying, Jason." It was awkward, and I felt a little out of place as I opened each gift. A new set of watchmaking tools, a rare book I'd been eyeing for years, a custom photo album filled with old pictures of me growing up. But as uncomfortable as it was, it also felt nice. Like they were finally seeing me, really seeing me, for the first time. After dinner, we sat in the living room, sipping coffee and talking about old times. And for the first time in as long as I could remember, I didn't feel like an outsider. I felt like I belonged. Like maybe, just maybe, we could start to build something new. Things aren't perfect, they never will be. There's still a lot of healing left to do, and I know we'll probably stumble along the way. But I'm not giving up, because deep down, despite everything, I still want to be part of this family. I still want them to see me as more than just the independent one who never needed help. I want them to see Jason, their son, their brother, a person who has been waiting for years to feel like he mattered. And slowly, painfully, I think they're finally starting to see.